And time now for the Newsline conversation, where my two guests in the studio will be introducing them to you shortly. 27 days to the general election, opinion polls coming out indicating differences every 2 weeks or so. What does it mean? Is it actually indicating that people are changing their preferences, or is it indicating that those who are undecided are actually getting decided and making up their choice? This is an interesting one to find out. Dr. Tomov is a researcher who has conducted a lot of opinion polls in the country in the last couple of years. And Kipruto Rapkiro is a politician. He's a seasoned politician, has been in the cabinet, has run political parties, and they join me in the studio this evening. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Dr. Tomov, the latest research released by TIFA, where you were leading as a researcher here, is showing us something new. Raila Odinga, the most popular candidate, with 27% with 42%. William Ruto with 39%. Professor George Ojakoya 4%. The number of undecided, the percentage of undecided dropping to 10%, up from 15% in May, and those who did not want to respond at 5%. Now, if we look at this and what you had released earlier in May, there's a shift. Raila Odinga was at 39% in May, now at 42%. William Ruto was at 35% in May, now at 39%. It's an increase. But then those who were undecided in May, 15% dropping to 10%. Those who did not want to respond to these questions from you, 8% in May, now at 5%. From just the top, what does this tell us? What does this mean?
Thanks. Nice to be here and together with Honorable Kirwa. As you were suggesting in putting out the question, these changes that you identified are very similar with what we saw or have seen before the last 3 elections, where I was also doing survey work. And that is sort of like if you're being taken to the hangman's noose, your mind concentrates on what it means to be alive, with all due respect to people who've ever faced the death penalty. But as we approach August 9th, as you were pointing out, more people are making up their minds. Whether all the people who state they're undecided at any time and whenever a survey is done are really so, we think, based on other qualitative research, that some of them are just a bit shy to say. And the fact that in almost every survey, there are more women who say they're undecided than men. That may be because they're waiting for some male head of household to tell them how to vote, or they're just, even in a confidential personal interview, whether face-to-face or on a mobile phone, are just hesitant to let us know that. But that's a comparison. I think there were 15% of women who said they had decided, only 5% of men, and we got the average of 10%. So that's pretty common. But overall, to answer the other part of your question about what's changed, statistically, really nothing since the last survey, because we limited this question about who you would vote for to only those who said, in an answer to an earlier factual question, not an opinion question, are you a registered voter? And for those who told us that they were, we didn't ask for proof, how certain are you that you will vote? And there was a small percent, 10%, who said, for whatever reasons, they certainly will not vote. So we removed those respondents from the calculations that you were just referring to. And that produces a slightly larger margin of error, closer to plus or minus 2.7, which could be a range of 5.4% when you put the plus and the minus 2.7 together. So if Raila Odinga has increased by 1% since last time, there's really not, that is his margin over William Ruto has fallen by 1% from 4% to 3%. There's really no difference. But when you look at the trend over time, which we also presented over the last 2 years, the one thing that really jumps out is that whereas the level of expressed voting intention for the deputy president has been in all the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 surveys between 35 and 40%. Raila Odinga has come from just, I think it is 15% 2 years ago to where he is now at 42%.
Because of the choice of running mates?
No, we haven't seen really any change in his position. I mean, he was 39% last time, as you said,
yeah,
and now 42. The deputy president, William Ruto, was 35. He's at 39. That is mainly the decline, as you also said, of the undecideds, once people make up their minds. Even if a few undecided people have now gone to the new candidate who's at least registering a percentage, and that is George Wajakoya.
I'm interested to find out, though, when we see a high percentage of people not willing to respond to your questions, in February, 11%, in May, 8%, in June, 5%, what does this mean? What question do you ask them for them to say they are not willing to respond?
Very good. For this particular presidential question, we asked whether you're going to vote in the August 9th, 2022 election or not, who would you like Kenya's next president to be? Now, why some people wouldn't even say they're undecided, but would rather just say, sitaki hiyo swali, tuendelee. Instead of saying sijaamua, because most of our interviews are in Swahili, not all, 60 to 70% people prefer to be interviewed in Swahili. Why they just declined to answer the question, whether they think that even the assurance that they were given of anonymity, even the fact they agreed to be interviewed at the beginning, and they are people who had given us their phone numbers in the past in face-to-face surveys, if it was a mobile phone survey. That's a very interesting research question that I haven't got the answer to. But we do see, as we move closer, and I should say the last two surveys, we didn't ask that question. We said, who are you going to vote for? Because we didn't want to ask the who are you going to vote for question until IEBC had told us which presidential application certificates had been accepted.
Okay. So in the last question then, in June, you already had the candidates.
Also in May, because May, we did that survey 2 days after the DP had announced his running mate of Rigathi Gachagua, and 1 day after Raila had announced his running mate, Martha Karua. And therefore, the first question we asked after we got their demographics, whether they're employed, education level, and so on, is, who is the running mate of these two candidates? Who are the running mates? And we found that 85% of all our respondents could name Raila's running mate, but only 59% could name the deputy president's running mate. And we used those answers to also profile support for the presidential candidates based on those who could, at that point, could and could not name the running mates, which we distributed in May.
I don't know.
Excuse me?
So when you ask, do you know who the running mates for Raila Odinga and William Ruto are, would people say, I know Martha Karua, Raila Odinga, and the other one say, I don't know, or vice versa? Is it I don't know, or is somebody hesitating in how they respond?
No, we give them a chance, and we divided people, the respondents, to that question into two groups. Those who gave the correct name, and those who gave either an incorrect name, said I don't know, or didn't answer the question.
Okay.
And we found that it was true for both of the main presidential candidates. More people, about the same proportion, who knew the running mates said that they were going to vote for them. So at that point, just 48 or 24 hours after the running mates were named, we didn't see any running mate effect. And likewise, if I can jump to this current survey, we really don't see much of a running mate effect, even if, as was carried in the article in today's Standard, reporting the poll, because Standard had contributed some questions to it, which you published a week ago, we could see that those who could name the running mates, again, there was no appreciable difference, even if those who were supporters and planning to vote for Raila Odinga, 90% of them thought that the running mate, being Martha Karua, would help Raila Odinga get more votes, whereas only 67% who were voting for Ruto and knew that his running mate is Rigathi Gachagua thought that that would help the DP get more votes. But in fact, we see that the DP has actually gained 1% in this poll from 3 weeks ago. So maybe it's people's perception of how useful a running mate is going to be, especially on Raila Odinga's side, is not yet borne out by these numbers that we got from the survey. There's still more than 3 weeks to go before the election, and as you know, and Honorable Kirwa will know better than either of us, what really matters is voter turnout, whether people are motivated
to come out to vote.
Yes.
Let's get into you, Mheshimiwa Kipruto Kirwa. You have consumed opinion polls, you have consumed the ground, right, over the very many years that you've been in politics.
Yes.
When you say this, the trend, like Dr. Wolf has basically just taken us through in the last, let's say, 18 months or so even.
Yes.
Do you see that that is a reflection of what the ground is actually saying?
Yes, it is the reflection, given the fact that for more than 3 years, William Ruto was running a lone show. There was no serious presidential candidate who had been unleashed to the people. But from the beginning of the year, it was clear that Raila was going to be the main opponent to William Ruto. And subsequent, Raila has demonstrated
figures going up.
Yes, a lot of presence on the ground and changing some of the areas that we did not expect that Raila would be able to change. Therefore, the trend has moved the way Tom said at the beginning, from where Raila was doing less than 28% up to now a serious contention where the race is proving almost to be too tight to be able to predict effectively. The second issue is the issue of undecided voters, which to a certain extent worries me, but I know Kenyans at times are a bit secretive about their choice of candidates. And therefore, the undecided and those who do not want to answer questions collectively are now at 15%.
This 14, yeah, 10 plus 4 or 10 plus 5, yeah.
Yes, 15%. This could be the deciding vote that we decide whether William Ruto or Raila Odinga is going to be the next president of Kenya.
Kirwa, do you honestly believe that there are people who at this stage, close to the election, with 27 days to go, or even when you're conducting the poll, there are people who are undecided?
Well, I think some could be undecided, but some could almost be saying, why do you ask me that question? It is my right to know who to vote for.
So somebody's just being secretive?
Yeah, somebody's being secretive.
Choice. I don't want to tell you.
Yes, I don't want to tell you who I'm going to vote for. It happens in many cases because, you know, the Kenyan public, given the fact that the governments that have subsequently taken over after colonialism, they have behaved like they're interrogating people. So when they see anybody in official kind of arrangement, they imagine this person is coming to interrogate me. And at times they shy away from telling you the truth.
Have you ever feared that that is what's happening?
I wouldn't say I would fear. I fear it. We know that Honorable Kirwa is completely right. But I think from the point of view of studying political behavior, in particular with regard to elections, and elections in Africa, we have to recognize, whether we're an African political scientist or somebody from elsewhere, we have to recognize that the process of deciding a vote in Africa in general, and in Kenya in particular, is much more social or communal than it is in Europe or the West, where it's much more individualistic. I've done research on a number of elections in Kenya. When I was here in the late 70s doing my doctoral research, I was not only researching the 79 election, which took place while I was here, but I was also asking people about how they voted in the independence elections and then in 74. And I remember interviewing one woman one day, and I asked her if she voted in the 1963 election. And she said yes. And I said, who did you vote for? And she said, sitasema kwa sababu yule alipata ushindi ilikuwa muzi wa Mungu. Kwa hivyo kura yangu haithuru. Niulize swali lingine. So even asking people about how they voted afterwards, now, if you want to go on the ground and do research during this period, up to the election and then after, maybe even in the place where you come from. And of course, every Kenyan area has its own sort of local microculture and so on.
Yeah.
But we know in some areas of the country, clan elders tell people how to vote. Yeah. Sometimes these clan elders, or even prominent village elders or other leaders who are respected, are negotiating with local politicians or other important groups in the area till almost the last minute and decide where do we want to put our eggs, in which basket. And that also raises another sort of side of the question that you just asked Mheshimiwa, and that is, what is the impact of particular forces of decision-making on people, and in particular, in the context of our discussion, the polls? To what extent will people, whether they're local leaders or individual voters, say, now, I've seen Raila at 42, I've seen Ruto at 39, I've seen Wajakoya at 7 or whatever, or going back to 2007, the poll I was associated with at Stedman. We saw Raila at 45, I think 46, Kibaki at 44, Kalonzo at 10. Does this actually affect how people vote? Would that have affected, for example, Kalonzo's supporters to say, you know, it's not just Stedman. Stedman said Kalonzo's around 10%. Strategic Africa said he was around 10, 11%. Infotrack said, so do I want to, quote unquote, waste my vote for him, or do I want to make a choice between Raila or Kibaki? What happened? The election was conducted. ECK told us Kalonzo had 10%. And nobody in Kalonzo's campaign ever claimed any rigging. So that showed that in that case, at least, and I actually went to Machakos and interviewed some people who had seen the polls. They said it hadn't changed their intention at all. Even if they knew Kalonzo couldn't win that time.
So Kalonzo's
uchaguzi ujao anaweza kupata ushindi. Hata Kibaki amejaribu mara tatu.
They supported their man. They were not going for, you know, where the vote is going to land.
So in every election, people who are serious about studying the impact of polls on voters as well as campaigns have to do the research, and it's not easy to find out what the impact would be. And I'll end by just leaving this question in the air. In a democracy where voter education should include, in a free country, polling results, is it good or bad for that democracy if polls showing one candidate is way ahead of the other? If it changes the vote, is that good or bad? That's a question for you people to decide.
And that's the point of our conversation this evening, and we'll get into it. Let's just do that build up again, because the same question that we are having a conversation earlier is whether there are people who will tell you the truth. I imagine that by the time you're coming to ask somebody who they're going to vote for as their presidential candidate, you have done a number of questions before this, you know, just getting the demographic questions and also getting them comfortable and making them feel that you are trustworthy, all right? So at what point do you ask the question whether you are going to participate in the election? I can imagine the sequence of questions is before you even ask who's your preferred candidate, you'll ask me whether I am going to vote. You've asked me, of course, whether I am a registered voter and all those things. Am I going to vote? And then who's my preferred candidate? You know, if I've given you all the answers to demographics and all, and I've also told you I'm going to vote, why would I hide who I'm going to vote for?
Well, again, that would be a question that would have to be researched in a more complicated way, but let me just, you've touched on something that's very interesting about the sequence of the questions. Now, as I said earlier, when we're doing mobile phone polls, all these numbers were given us to me by the people we're interviewing at a previous household face-to-face survey, where at the end, and the other companies do the same thing, they say, do you or somebody else in the household have a mobile phone? In Kenya, the mobile phone preference is 80, 85%. There's some especially marginal areas that don't have network and so on. Most people have. And then we ask them, would you agree to give us your phone number or that of your brother or your husband or whatever? So if we're doing a quick mobile phone survey, which is cheaper, because we don't have to send people to, that we could call you. Almost everybody says yes. Kenyans love to be interviewed. Okay. In fact, when I go around Nairobi or even outside, I was down in Kwale a short time ago, people say, why don't you interview me? How come you've never called me? Kenyans really like, they're still celebrating the freedom that they have.
Give you their phone numbers.
They're still celebrating the freedom they have to give answers that this gentleman here knows more about the new dawn, so-called, in 2002 than I do, even if I was here then. Sometimes we have clients who are loading questions in the same way as Standard Group did on this one.
Yeah.
They were all on the election. So we could put them among our own election questions. Although we ask those questions before we ask the question about who would you vote for, so as not to bias any of those questions.
Okay.
But sometimes we have clients who are loading questions on health or agriculture or education. And often they say, please ask our questions first before you get into your political questions, so people don't think this is really part of somebody's campaign. So after the demographic questions that you referred to, we would then accord to the client's wishes. Some other clients say you can ask mine at the end, whatever their topic is, or and sometimes they say you put them where you want. So we might have first a series of questions about election issues, registration status. Then we want to break that sort of monotony and ask questions about healthcare or education, and then go back to the ones which you were talking about now, about the voting preferences. So I haven't seen any experiment. You're actually raising the question of a very interesting experiment. Would fewer people decline to answer the question or say they're undecided based exactly where in the survey that question comes? Give us some money, and we'll do the experiment for you, and you will release the results, and you'll be on the front page of your own newspaper.
Mheshimiwa Kira, would you have some money that we can give Dr.
Now, perhaps after elections.
After elections, depending on where your chips fall.
Yes, but one thing that is very evident, in 1992, we in Kano were worried that Kibaki was going to thrash us up to about Christmas time. And the tide changed completely, and Matiba took over the way from Mount Kenya all the way to Busia. And some of
those... Shikuku as his de facto running mate, yes.
Shikuku as his running mate. So some of the areas that look a bit stable now might change on the eve of elections, about 10 days before elections. The Kenyans have a tendency almost to be swept by a certain wave towards the end. But some of the areas will remain relatively the same, leaving the candidates almost with what is perceived as their stronghold. But as we were discussing outside there, it is clear that in all the 9 regions, no candidate has been getting more than 2/3 of the votes, which is also a very important factor, that this election is an election that you must win every single vote for you to make sure that you win the vote.
Campaigning every day.
Every day. That's why all the candidates are crisscrossing the country. None is taking chances, although they are posturing, each side is posturing that we are ahead of the other. But I still believe this election is yet to be decided. The last 15 days of the election may actually decide who takes the prize.
And I think he is correct in 2 senses. Not only who might be elected president, but whether in fact we will need a runoff. Because as we've seen from our figures with the entrance of Wajakoya, if you do the calculation, you'll see that Raila doesn't have 50% yet in our figures. So the last 15 days, I couldn't agree more. Now, we do have the publication of Electoral Polls Act in Kenya. You can do a survey whenever you want, even the day before the election. But no survey firm or media house could release those results within 5 days. I know one researcher who's planning on doing a survey very, very close to that deadline, but they're not going to release the results. They're going to use it for analysis afterwards.
After the election.
You can even do a survey. We could do one for you, Eric. Give it to you on 8th of August, but the file would have to be locked. And we would only allow you to comply with the law to let you reveal those results after all the polls have closed.
Okay.
And it cannot influence any votes. So again, you can find some more money, and we can do that one as well.
Do you think, Kiro,
yes,
this, as we are seeing,
yes,
Dr. Wolf is insisting that there has been no change, really,
yes,
no significant change in pattern over the last couple of months.
3 weeks, not months, just the last 3 weeks.
Over the last couple of weeks.
Yes.
Before Raila was going up, yeah.
Is it because the campaigns have hit a plateau, they have reached their audiences? Is it because the message has now ended with the novelty of the message? What is it that could be causing that plateau?
Another good question.
Well, let me make an attempt of that particular question. I think there are a number of factors, one of which is that many Kenyans have decided who they want to vote for.
81%, in fact.
Yes. And therefore, whatever you do, you are not adding more. we have reached what economists say the rule of diminishing returns, and therefore each candidate must, of necessity, look for a more innovative way of catching up with the voters. As you know, in all campaigns, 10% of the votes are decided in the rallies, but 90% are already decided through other methods.
What are these other methods?
Other methods is, of course, including a community mobilization, the traditional supporters for certain candidates, the way you know Raila has been enjoying certain traditional support. All those are factors that cumulatively present themselves towards the tail end. So it will mean that if one candidate makes a goof on the eve of elections, that may decide his fate. And therefore, each of the candidates, if I was to suggest anything to them, is to be careful as we go towards the tail end of this election and improve mobilization of voters so that to improve the turnout. You see, what Tom does is just to do survey. But what will determine the winner is the question of those who will turn out.
That's right.
Because you can go to a county like, let's say, Trans Nzoia, with about 400,000 voters, and you go to another county like Kakamega with almost more than 1 million voters, or Kiambu. The opinion polls may precipitate the kind of predominant perception by the people. But if you are to turn it and say in Kiambu, a turnout of 80% means so much in terms of votes. The turnout in Trans Nzoia of 80% means so much in terms of votes. Then you'll also be able to see who is likely to win. And therefore, if, let's say, Raila supporters, Ruto supporters in Kiambu improve their turnout, the winning will be dependent upon those who will be mobilized to turn out on the election day.
Am I hearing you gentlemen say that we are starting from the base? Each of the candidates has their core, right?
Yes.
Which is, well, based on various things, but primarily it is region and tribal. Yeah. So when we've been seeing these candidates just traversing the country and campaigning and hearing, you know, is Ruto raiding Raila's traditional base of the coast, is Raila raiding Ruto's base, is and is Western up in the air to be gained or lost. What are we saying then?
If I could...
If it's already a call, then it means it cannot move.
Well, if I could just piggyback for a moment on Honorable. You know, we asked this, for all of those who said that they were registered, and 94% of our respondents said they were registered, we know that's slightly inflated, because with 22.1 million registered voters and an adult population of around 26, 27 million, we know that the actual proportion of registered Kenyans is closer to 85% than 94, 86, somewhere there. So a few of those people lied to, I guess, to look like good citizens, but that's normal. But of those who said that they were registered, we asked how likely it is that they will vote. 70% said definitely, and 13% said probably, 2% said probably not, and 10% definitely not, that they won't vote. Now, right away, those people now, we removed those who said they definitely would not vote from asking them the presidential vote question. But you could see that in these other categories, 2% probably not, 6% probably will, but not certain. That may contribute to the eventual voter turnout figure that we get. And although in the last couple of elections, it's been pretty high, the national average has been in the mid-80s, ranging from the mid-90s around the mountain and parts of the Rift Valley, all the way down to the coast where it's been below 2/3, 64% or whatever. So there's been a variation. So that's one, also could be reflected in this undecided figure, that these people at the end of the day may not vote. The second thing I would like to say, and again, I'm sure Honorable knows more about this than I do, is that when we're asking the question about the presidential vote, and especially looking at undecideds and no responses, as well as the vote itself, I agree completely, based on past research. with what Honorable Kirwa said, as our figures show, that roughly 4 out of 5 every Kenyans who's going to vote have already made up their mind. We've got a total of 81% from our figures now. If you look at the poll by Radio Africa published in the Star today, that was done a week after ours, their undecided number is even lower. And then that will continue to the election. But the one thing, critical thing we have to remember here is that on August 9th, Kenyans will be voting for 6 different positions.
Yep.
And I would be very interested after the election to do some research, again, if you can give us the funding, to find out when people actually made up their mind who their presidential choice was and what was the factor. Because, for example, if you've got candidates for governor, whether they're associated with Kenya Kwanza or Azimio, let's go and listen to their speeches now and find out how often they say, mimi sitoweza kutekeleza sera zangu mpaka niwe na rais ambaye ataniunga mkono kwa sera zangu zote na uhusiano baina ya serikali ya kitaifa na ya county. I mean, we need to see how they are actually trying to mobilize their own voters. And the same thing for members of parliament and maybe even down to MCAs. So it may be that in these remaining days, that a critical factor in getting people to decide and whom to decide to vote for will be based on the mobilization that takes place below the presidential level. But I would ask Honorable, from his past experience, how important these lower level races are, especially in helping, encouraging, pushing those undecided voters to vote.
For the presidential vote.
Yes.
You've done the strategy for various
He's been on the ground, he's done it.
Yes, I've done it even for myself. But of course, at times you cannot be 100% accurate. But what is important is that the more the candidates and the more popular certain candidates are, the better is the mobilization process for the presidential candidate. But there is a danger in some areas where people may say they are in Azimio or they are in Kenya Kwanza, but they find the ground is a bit jittery. And Raia nowadays, they are fond of saying, Eric, ask for your vote. Wachana nae. We've decided, or wachana nae, which may mean they are not comfortable with your presidential candidate, they are comfortable with you, but they are not comfortable with your presidential candidate, or don't spend time telling us about our presidential candidate, we have decided. So ask for your vote, give us your agenda, give us your program, give us your manifesto. I wanted to say CV, but that's not important in the field of politics. Nowadays there are CVs that we don't know how they came in. So that is very important. The second issue, which I think is also important when it comes to the issue of mobilization, is that even on the election day, some of the candidates employ all manner of tricks, including looking for mobilizers along the road to tell them go vote, go vote. Others in the evening by around 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, they go almost to every village to know who has not voted.
Wanatafuta wino.
Yes, wanatafuta wino. If you have not voted, they ask you why. If there is somebody, possibly elderly person, they will look for that person, mobilize and take him to vote. So all these are tricks that we need to use. Now, something possibly cannot be captured by Tom is also in some of the strongholds, there is a tendency to allow dead voters to resurrect and go vote, then go back to their graves. That's why it is important when we are talking about manual register and electronic, so that, you know, IBC said there are certain areas, I can't remember the number, where people could not have effective access in terms of the new technology.
It's about 1,000 polling centers that have 3G and 4G.
So it would be useful that if, let's say, you cannot identify me electronically, you can also look for my name and you'll be able to allow me to vote as a voter. And that is good for cross-checking. And of course, the law is very clear that there must be a complementary way of ensuring that we check. So my worry, and this is where we feel we should reduce cheating, is where agents of the opposing camp are not allowed to witness a process, and therefore vote stuffing is likely to take place in areas where some candidates control more than 80% support in those areas.
And that's a real danger, isn't it?
It
Yes.
is.
There are those strongholds where you may find a certain polling station.
Yes.
It doesn't matter how many agents are there for the various candidates for the other 5 seats,
Yeah.
but they all in unison,
Yep.
almost 99%
Yeah.
on the presidential candidate of choice.
Yeah.
We know from some election observer reports and other research in the 2007 election
Yeah.
that, I don't know if I want to call them dead voters, but there was certainly some aspects of the voting and tallying that made the final announcement of the official results questioned. I mean, it led to almost a civil war in the country, and as I said earlier, even the late chair of ECK, Wanaki Buitu, at one point said he wasn't sure who won. But I would just like very quickly to mention, not in this survey, but in a recent survey, I think in April, we tried to investigate this issue that Honorable mentioned, and that is, we asked the political party question: which political party do you support most or feel closest to? And people generally gave us, a national level party. But then we asked, is there any other party that you also support, perhaps especially for local races? And we got more than 30% who said yes, exactly what you're saying. Because of, we could have a whole academic seminar on this. What's been going on with the evolution of political parties in Kenya? How do they relate to the individuals who decide to come together through elite bargains before each election? So you see in one election, Honorable Mudavadi is with Raila, the next one he's against him. Kalonzo standing on his own in 2007 against Kibaki and then becoming the vice president. Raila supporting Kibaki in 2002, running against him in 2007, and Ruto supporting Kibaki. And so, Raila, and then, this is all. So it's very important now, especially, for reasons which we don't have time to get into, as to why there has been such a focus on local parties. Remember, the DP at first he said he doesn't want to have a coalition. You've got to join UDA or else. But then he had to buckle in when he saw he could catch these two fish called Mudavadi and Wetangula, which has boosted him somewhat in Western. He had to make that compromise, so he's now ended up with 11 parties there, as opposed to the 26 in Azimio. And the last thing I would just say is that, again, coming back to something that Meshima just said, I remember going around Limuru on voting day in 2013. Just as you said, by mid-afternoon, I was asking people, is there anybody here who is still voting? They said no, and everybody they came up to me, showed me the ink. And they pointed to rows of kiosks and small shops around. They said, you are not allowed to buy bread, milk, tea, whatever, unless you've got ink on your finger. It was a complete communal boycott of people who hadn't voted, just as you said. Now, one thing we know also from research, this kind of mobilization, as just described, is not even all across the country. It's particularly strong where the community has a presidential candidate and a running mate, but then it kind of trickles down. So if you have, let's say, 13–14% of Kenyan population is Luo, 13–14% is Kalenjin, and then if we add the two running mates and say Kikuyus are another 18 or 19%, that leaves something like 55–60% of the country that doesn't have a horse in that race. How are those people going to be mobilized? Many people, and we've seen this also in our research, are fed up with politicians. One question we asked, and this may discourage both registration and voting. One question we asked at the end of the survey: which of these two statements do you think best describes the motivation of people like him sitting here, and I'll call him rather, Mheshimiwa. And the questions were, when people stand for elections, which of these motivations do you think is most accurate? They're doing it for the benefit, they want to get elected for the benefit of their community and the country, or B, they want to get elected for their personal or family interests. For all of Kenyans, 53% for their own personal or family interests. Only 38% said to serve their community or country. The others weren't sure.
That's a very high number. 38% actually believe that politicians are seeking this.
Well, let's see what your view is. And when we
You're not doing so badly off, Mheshimiwa.
And when we hope the people voted for him, Tata. And when we correlated that with who you're going to vote for president, we didn't find any statistical differences. Basically the same. But for this majority, although small,
Yeah.
53% who really think politicians are in this for their own.
So it doesn't really matter what
Yeah.
they do with their vote.
I'm sure if we had asked that question, I wish I had, in 2007, 2013, even 2017, I think that would have been higher, that people thought that they were going into it for the country. I think the switching of positions, the condition of the economy, the fact that the DP, who is part of this government and is still part of this government,
Is the leader of the opposition in
is
government.
leading up the opposition. I think that creates some confusion and maybe also contributing to this undecided. What do these people actually represent? Just to be fair, that's for the DP. Now look on the other side. Martha Karul was part of Linda Katipa opposing BBI that the former Prime Minister was supporting for more than a year. And now they're very happy campaigning together. What is their policy with regard to BBI after they win, if they win? I don't know. I mean, so this may be contributing to some policy level confusion as to what these candidates actually represent.
There's a question on the elephant in the room. So you keep doing these polls, you plus all the other research firms. Do they really matter? Do they really influence the choice of the electorate at any point? Or do they influence the communication and the behavior of the politicians as they go out to campaign? I'll start with you, Mheshimiwa Kirwa. Does it matter what you see in these polls?
For me, as a student of politics, I would say it matters in the sense that even those who are disputing what Tom is doing, they will still go through and look at some of the underlying issues.
And they're doing their own polls.
Yes.
They told us they are.
Yes. But my worry is that there is a plethora of opinion polls that are now being released every other day. And it worries me whether are they genuine or are they geared towards making certain candidates have some advantage over the others, or is it just to allow them to have a feel-good effect that we are doing well? Because I know these opinion polls are done by them. They are those done by the system itself, by the NIS. And at the end of the day, all these, they matter. If somebody is very keen and if somebody is very objective, which I know many of the organizations are. Now, there are also two other issues that are emerging, especially in Kenya. One is the issue of the presidential candidate and the running mate. If you are to check 2013, 2017, and perhaps even earlier, where I think the two elections, if you are to check carefully, you'll realize where a presidential candidate comes from, there is highly likely to be a higher turnout. And also where a deputy or a running mate comes from. This therefore means that the galvanizing force is the make-believe that one of our own, when he gets to power, is going to improve our welfare. That is something that we need to be asking ourselves as Kenyans, whether it is true or whether it will assist the country or not. There is also something that parties have to be alive to: the increasing number of independent candidates across the board.
Good point.
Because, I remember in one of the speeches of Mwalimu Nyerere, he said, if you do not find haki kwa CCM, people will look for that haki elsewhere. And therefore Kenyans are going to independent, not because of their choice, but because they find that they did not find some kind of level playing ground within the political parties. And the managers of parties should, of necessity, learn to improve their interaction with the public, so that if the system is said we shall use opinion polls to determine whether Eric is more popular than Kirwa, then we use a standard way of doing things. Yeah, because internationally, political parties, they have certain leverage over who the candidate is, whether it's a Labour region, whether it is conservative, whether it's Republican or Democrats in America. They have some kind of leverage who becomes the candidate. But here in Kenya, even on the eve of elections, you tell somebody you've been zoned out of this area in Nairobi, because this is for Jubilee, this is for ODM, this is for Fort Kenya, this is for UDA, let's say like in some areas like Trans Nzoia. And yet somebody has spent a lot of money, a lot of resources and time campaigning, knowing that he's going to be given a fair chance.
And mobilize party members to participate
in the nomination. So these are some of the questions that as we improve our democratic practices, my hope is that the leaders of political parties will improve their interaction with the public.
Well, I don't think you even need to hope. I think they're going to be forced by circumstances. If what you're saying is people are even going more and more into independent, they're voicing their dissatisfaction with political parties, then the leadership of political parties has got to listen to that voice. What do you think?
So I just a little comment before I come to that. Something you brought up earlier, and also Honorable mentioned about a significant number of other surveys popping up every now and then. I happen to believe in freedom of information. And if I were the managing editor of your newspaper, I wouldn't totally ignore those surveys. I'd publish them. I wouldn't put them on the front page the way you would from us and a reputable firm that's a member of the professional association that has a track record and so on. I would do it as a news story. Hey, this company we never heard of, or we can't find its physical location or whatever, but it conformed to the act. It has told us their methodology, and so on and so forth. And maybe I'd put it on page 8 or 9 or something like that. There was a company which we'd never heard of before in January, which released a poll. Only one newspaper in Kenya covered it, but they covered it as a story. Who is this company? Why have you, it was actually from outside Kenya. Why have you come? Where have you worked before? And raising some questions. There was some quotes from the interview. So it wasn't produced as this is a competing survey number, but this is another company. So in fact, we had a little debate at the IEBC media discussion on opinion polls on Sunday. And I really had to say that let all the polls be published wherever they are, and let the chips fall where they may. Let the public judge. I always say there's safety in numbers. Not the numbers we produce, because there are margins of error and some people may hide them. But if we had 50 or 5,000 survey firms, reputable ones, a media house could do an average of polls, and people could see where are the outliers. And finally, I was privileged to see an internal memo within the Standard Group. I didn't steal it. It was shared with me by an editor on all the criteria that you use before you decide to publish. And this was circulated more than a year ago when we weren't so close to the election. And whereas I found some of the criteria so stringent, in fact, I told my friend who works here, by the time you had an outside consultant or even an in-house expert tick all of these criteria, other media houses would have published. Maybe a week earlier, so it'd be too late. But it showed that there was a great deal of tension. And having said that about Standard Group, I remember Joe Dindo over at Nation before the 2013 election. There was also an internal memo saying we have to be careful because our corporate reputation is also at stake. And as you were suggesting, misleading polls, if they're taken seriously and they are wrong, can have a negative effect. And I would just say polls can be wrong for one of two reasons. Either genuine methodological failures, as we saw in the UK with the Brexit polls and in the US 2016, because not enough people who were opposed to membership in the EU continuing or were in favor of Trump agreed to participate in those polls, and the pollsters weren't able to compensate for that with weighting. And of course, the other reason for incorrect polls is when they're deliberately, for whatever motive, fabricated. I think the more they come out, the better. Let's see what they show.
It evens out.
And let's interrogate them.
Dr.
So I think we have to have some criteria. But just finally with nominations, I think I've sympathized with these political parties because choosing who is the proper candidate, it involves so many things. First of all, is it a safe seat or not? Are we operating basically in a one-party area? So whoever gets our ticket is 95% going to win. In that case, I need somebody who's going to perform. I need somebody maybe who's got money, can contribute to the presidential campaign, because I know that person is going to be sitting in that county assembly or sitting in that Senate or whatever it is. In more competitive areas, as Meshimi was suggesting, it's riskier to impose, can backfire. And thank goodness, I say this as a non-Kenyan, but thank goodness that the Constitution and the Elections Act allows for independent candidates. So people who do feel aggrieved can still present themselves in front of the electorate.
I've got to conclude the conversation. The director is telling me we are out of time now. So I've got to ask you this question, Dr. Wolf, and it's the same one that I asked Mheshimiwa Kirwa. In a minute and shortened form of the answer. 40 plus years conducting opinion polls and observing the electoral process and politics in this country.
Me only 15 doing them.
You doing them, but you seeing and
I've been watching,
right?
Yes.
Do you think these opinion polls actually do influence voter perception and political campaigns?
The second part is easier to answer. They definitely influence campaigns. You can be sure, and I've talked to a number of people, including presidential candidates, after elections. It's not so easy to talk to them now. Going back at least to 2007, how they use polls internally. And I'm sure, although I can't quantify it at the moment, this election has seen the greatest, most extensive use of polls internally by campaigns than ever before. We heard it both from the deputy president himself, when he talked about our polls. We heard Governor Ndiritu from Laikipia, from Azimio, saying they're doing that, not just for picking candidates or doing their nominations in many cases, but also for tracking. So we know they're all doing those.
On the voter?
And, pardon me?
On the voter? Influence on the voter?
For the ones that become public, I think that gets back to the discussion we found earlier. I think I agree with Mheshimiwa that 80% would make their decision roughly no matter what the polls show, like those people in Ukumbani that I was talking about 2007. But there are some who will use them strategically to say, well, between these two, let's say at the end of the day, in 3 weeks, do I want to vote for this really entertaining and exciting Professor Wajakoya, even if I'm sure from the polls there's no way he can win, even if he might win in a future election, or do I want to, when I see the race is so tight between the deputy president and the former prime minister, whether I want to vote for one of the two? That's a democratic choice.
Okay.
But I'm sure to some extent, I can't measure it now, to some extent those polls will influence. And I think, again, that's part of freedom of information, freedom of democratic choice. Let people see, and if they say, no, I'm going to vote for this guy anyway. I'll give you one final example, and then I'll shut up. In the 2016-11, my brother, who is a Democrat, registered Democrat as I am, he did not vote for Hillary Clinton. He voted for the Green Environmental Party because he cares about the future of our environment. And when Trump beat Clinton and I went home from Kenya, I said, why the heck did you do that? He said, all the polls showed that Hillary was going to win. She didn't need my vote. But my heart is in the environment. And even if that environment party was only going to get 2%, I wanted to build it. So it influenced him, but in this case, he regrets it.
Thank you very much for that.
You want me to answer the same questions?
You already answered the question. I had asked you earlier. You said it.
Yeah.
We have run out of time. Thank you for joining us this evening. Kipruto Arap Kirwa, what are you now?
Thank you.
You know, I don't want to say you're a former politician.
I'm a politician. Once a politician, always a politician. I just want to say, the day you read obituary of a politician, you must be standing next to his grave. Otherwise, a politician can be reincarnated. Who knew that Biden will come back after Clinton and win the presidency in the US?
Right.
Many things happen. Abdoulaye Wade of Senegal, he reigned 35 years for presidency, and when he was 80, he won. And he won again. So anything is possible. I'm not yet 80.
And by the way, I'm reading now, as I told him, Dr. Shem Ochodo's book, former MP, on the NARC rainbow, in which this gentleman here, in years leading up to 2002, played a very prominent part.
Thank you.
Are you playing a role in the Azimio campaign?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yes.
So, politician Kipruto Arap Kirwa, thank you very much for joining us. Researcher Tom Wolf. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much as well for watching.
Yes.
This has been Newsline. We've been having a conversation with the two gentlemen about polls and the impact of opinion polls. My name is Eric Latif. Do have a lovely evening.